Hello and welcome to this special mashup episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social and governance. I'm your host, Andy Wood. As we enter a new year, it's always fun to think about what the future holds, both in the immediate 12 months and beyond. Today, we're replaying two of my favorite episodes from this season that focus on the future of sustainability reporting. Earlier this season, I sat down with Nadja Picard, partner and global reporting leader at PwC Germany. Listen as Nadja unpacks the concept of reporting-led transformation and how reporting can bring about broader change to propel businesses forward. So let's start off by going back to something that I already mentioned, which is that reporting-led transformation. So can we offer our listeners a definition of what you mean? And with that, how can the act of reporting really result in broader change and actually benefit companies?
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for that question. It's to me, reporting, corporate reporting particularly, is all about transparency. And in the case of sustainability reporting, what the big standard setters that have their standards out are really looking at is a tie into a company's strategy of that sustainability reporting. With it comes disclosures around targets and the performance measurement against those targets. If you do that and expand your corporate reporting beyond your financial reporting to include that, it opens up a dialogue with investors and other stakeholders. And in that dialogue, companies, much like is the case with normal investor relations currently on financial reporting, will get impulses on whether investors understand the strategy, the targets, and the performance measurements, whether they like it, whether they like it in comparison to peers. So there is a true dialogue evolving from that, which will then result in the company possibly changing its strategy, its sustainability strategy, or even better said, its business strategy that embeds sustainability thinking. But if you do that, you need the proper data, and that reporting will then also, as you talk in your within your company about strategy and transparency, you need the data to support it, and that will already highlight issues within the company through the internal management reporting, because what gets measured gets really managed. So that is then the driver for the reporting-led transformation that will ensue within a company.
Yes, I noticed that obviously we finished on data. That's a pretty frequently quoted challenge with sustainability in general. But if we're thinking specifically about shifting from sustainability reporting being a compliance focus, a requirement, to something that's actually an area of opportunity, what kind of things do organizations have to do to achieve that? Is it a matter of changing their mindset? Is there more they have to do to cover that?
Yeah, I will get to data, but I will start with something else, Andy. I will start with actually the strategy angle again. Most of the sustainability reporting frameworks, and particularly, again, the big standards, ISSB and the ESRSs that are out there, require a company to report on how their strategy takes sustainability matters into consideration, if and how. So they don't have to report something that is not there, but they will have to report how the strategy takes these things into consideration if they actually do. That's the first item of actually grasping the opportunity, because the alignment that needs to come with that within a company between the C-suite and supervisory bodies, directors all across the board, that's already the first instance where the debate and the discussion will unearth opportunities. Then again, if we then move from that broader debate into how can that broader debate be informed, we're back at the data challenge, right? So finding the right proper data that are reliable, that are transparent, that address the issues on point will then result in a deeper look into the organization and again unearth these opportunities.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we hear quite often is that there's a lot of focus on risk, but that organizations are finding it hard to find the time as well to look for opportunity. But I think you've just described that ideally that should naturally fall out of a process that they're working through that leads them to both compliance and also should surface these opportunities.
Now, look, I'm sitting in Europe, right? So compliance is coming our way very, very quickly. I think if companies need to spend the time to become compliant, so I think it's better to spend the time wisely, even if you spend a bit more time in actually digging into the data and trying to understand and trying to optimize. And companies will be faced by the stakeholder demands, by the investor demands, by regulators wanting to understand what it is they're talking about. So I think it's really a missed opportunity if you don't try to look for the opportunities.
Exactly. So I think you've mentioned briefly already that there are standards behind a lot of this work. Historically, a very mixed patchwork of frameworks, but we've been moving forward a lot. And you were part of a panel at the World Economic Forum with Elko van der Enden, who is, of course, the CEO of the Global Reporting Initiative, often called GRI, as well as Emmanuel Faber, who's the chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that panel was exploring the need for global alignment in reporting standards. And interoperability of reporting standards has, I think, come up in most conversations that I have had with sustainability professionals over the last year and a half. It's a really hot topic. So why is that alignment of the standards so important to everybody? And is that in part because of this backwards transformative effect on the companies?
Let's take the positive side of alignment and interoperability first for a second, if I may. So we've seen the publication of the final ISSB standards. We've now also seen the publication of the final ESRSs. And already almost the cry out of business and investors to urge both bodies to come to an understanding on how things look like has resulted in, for example, the definition of financial materiality to be the same. That's great. That will really start enabling better interpretation of reportings that are prepared under either standard. And they've also both commented very heavily on a lot of their climate reporting requirements being quite aligned, that there is already a lot of common ground. There is more common ground to be gained. And really, it is important to really get back to your question, Andy. It is really important because the transparency that we just discussed to stakeholders, to users of reporting, or inside a company to manage towards better outcomes, taking sustainability into consideration, will come at a higher cost if those data that are difficult to find and to report and to quality assure and control have to be reported in different ways because of different definitions, because of different boundaries, because of slight differences that are important for preparers, because it will also be very important for assurance providers. They are the last instance that needs to make sure that it's actually properly prepared on the basis status in alignment with the standards. If those nitty-gritty differences become too cumbersome, it will put too much burden on companies, and transparency and those opportunities that we just discussed will not be able to achieved, right? So that is really why everybody is asking for this alignment. It's not only the effort, it's also the time that is needed to unearth those differences, to explain them, that is much better spent on actually managing towards better outcomes.
Yeah, and I think we also hear there's been a steady demand for more comparability in the external transparent figures as well. And I've spoken over time to quite a few companies who are using different metrics or different internal calculations internally for their own management, and they're not able to necessarily align them with the external matrix that they're using. And I think everybody's just desperate for one set of information that actually describes everything comparably, whether that's in the house or externally to their investors and stakeholders. Obviously, we've been talking very nicely about standards, and the standards are, some of them are mandated, some of them I think there's hope that they will be mandated around the world. So regulation itself, however, that is the thing that's driving a lot of this. It's not just about the standards. So, for example, the CSRD also asks for reporting locations sign off. It asks for assurance. So it's bringing together a much bigger picture. And you recently wrote a piece for PwC where you stated that CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is resetting the value creation agenda. So could you describe briefly what you mean by that?
Yeah, so CSRD is coming, and is coming very quickly, right? The first companies have to report on their 2024 performance in early 2025. And while the letter of the CSRD, it is a reporting directive at the end, right? But it does call the intent really is to drive the change in business conduct that I just explained at the outset of our conversation, right? It does tie the strategy back to sustainability issues. It does require a business to identify the impacts, risks, and opportunities for its business. And it then asks companies to report their targets and then the performance against those targets next to a number of mandatory KPIs. Now, this will really then drive a change in performance, right? If you have to say out loud what you think and where you are at with your company, and that then gets consumed, it inevitably will result in a reaction to that, and that will drive the performance. So I think CEOs and chief executives in general are really, really well advised if they take this link to the strategy really at heart and integrate sustainability thinking into their strategy, right? So that's how CSRD, for example, I think is a very clear example of a reporting regulation, in fact it is, that has a certain purpose in mind. Now, that is special to the European Union because they are the regulator and they can mandate business to report on all these things with a bigger picture in mind around the Green Deal and enhancing sustainable business performance. That will be a different mechanism in other countries where, for example, ISSB standards might get adopted. This will be a much more indirect mechanism around the capital markets adopting that, and then through that dialogue with investors, the same behaviors hopefully will be driven out.
Yeah, we do see the very different approaches. Although I think one of the other waves that we've seen as an organization is that the CSRD, obviously it has some downstream or upstream effects, actually might be a better way of putting it. A lot of companies who are not headquartered in the European Union do have subsidiary presence and at least some substantial revenue presence in the European Union. And that regulation is not shy of asking them to also think about this reporting, whether it's at that subsidiary level or later on when eventually the extraterritorial requirements come in. So we've seen companies thinking about that, as a burden, but we've also seen some companies, to our earlier conversation, thinking of it as an opportunity and looking at the standards that have been produced to support the CSRD, the ESRS, as something that's a bit of a guide to tell them what their peers will be reporting and, keep that communication in line. So I think we will see some very sort of interesting effects outside the European Union as well.
No, absolutely. And we're working with some companies as well that are not headquartered in the EU that actually plan on or are considering at the moment, I don't think any formal decisions have been taken, but that are really considering applying CSRD reporting and the ESRS at the consolidated level. And that's companies who actually think hard about unearthing those opportunities that we talked about and using the compliance with the standards as a possibility to actually openly talk about their risks and how they are addressing them and the opportunities that come from that, right? So that is a very good example that you're just citing here.
So we mentioned CEOs briefly earlier. Obviously, strategy and business model, that makes a lot of sense. Are there other ways we see CEOs getting involved in this sustainability movement? And is that different to the way we see CFOs becoming involved? Or are we seeing a sort of different executive responsibilities across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, every organization is slightly different, but at the higher level of looking at it, the CEO is the leader of the company, right? So if we talk about strategy, if we talk about performance targets, and then being responsible for achievement of those performance targets, whether they are financial or whether they're a combination of financial and sustainability or only sustainability, it is the CEO who's on the spot and will be responsible to explain this to the outside, to the public. And if the CEO is not convinced about combining strategy with sustainability thinking, it will be hard to get the organization to follow, right? So in contrast, if you look at the CFO, I think the CFO, and I already beg forgiveness to some people who might not like the term, but I think the CFO often is the chief enabler. The CFO is responsible for a lot of processes. We all know that from financial reporting. It's a financing requirements sit with the CFO. Controlling of business processes and target evaluation and all of that sit in the CFO function. Engagement with customers and suppliers, contracting with business partners, all of that often sits in the CEO office. And with what I've been saying, I think it starts to become apparent that there is a very special responsibility of the CFO to make sustainability reporting, but also the performance measurement and driving the results possible, right? CFOs are the ones who know about group reporting, who know about controls and implementing technology to help with all of that. So the CFO is really, really instrumental in making any ambition on sustainability paired with transparent reporting happen in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, we're going to come back. We hear actually that list of expertise, ability to understand group reporting in that environment is something that we hear really commonly from organizations as they're considering how to bring finance organizations in or where the responsibilities should lie. I'm not sure I've heard as often actually some of that bigger picture. So I think maybe that is one of those areas where CFOs can really make a bigger difference than they're able to at the moment.
There's one more angle, right? If you think about it, we hear so much about greenwashing and can these data really be relied upon? So to me, the CFO is also the person who brings a lot of trust into the whole system. If the CFO gets properly engaged, users of the information understand that the information can be trusted. It comes from a controlled environment. So the data that need to be found and dealt with need that rigor around granularity, around sourcing, around is it actually verifiable what we're saying? And that often is an instinct that a CFO has. Chief operating officers or others, of course, they're interested in doing the right thing, but they sometimes don't have those CFO instincts that ask the right question at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to pick up, and it might sound like a bit of a non sequitur, but it does tie very strongly actually back to that verifiability and that rigor in processes. So Workiva conducted a survey of ESG practitioners actually, and the overwhelming majority polled agreed that having adequate technology, so that was 95%, is critical to managing the reporting process. And 94% said technology is also important for mapping disclosures to regulations, frameworks, and standards. And I'd also argue data should be included in that picture as well. What role does technology play in this reporting-led transformation? Is it just about that rigor on the reporting, or does it help elsewhere as well?
Yeah, to me, it's the two E's, right? Efficiency and enabling that technology brings into the whole sustainability area, right? We all know about manual processes and how error prone those can be despite the best intention of the individuals performing them. And we all know the efficiencies that came about in financial reporting when we start to implement technology at whatever process, at the ERP process, at the data sourcing process, automatic controls are so much more efficient and easier once they are done right than manual controls. So transporting that whole thinking of financial reporting into sustainability reporting makes total sense to me. And technology will be key to making a cumbersome exercise. And again, let's not forget that we are not so familiar with all the thinking and the sources of the data because we haven't done that for decades and decades and sometimes centuries as we are with financial reporting. So technology needs to help us to come to grips with all these data that we need to manage and then put into a reporting. And then on top of that, across the world, we see increasing regulatory action, and not only regulatory action or reporting, but regulatory action around sustainability issues and topics. So again, the case for technology, I think, is very, very obvious.
We're heading towards the closeout for this episode. We like to try and end with a piece of advice or something that companies can take away with them to get going on the topic of the day. So I'm going to ask this as a single. I know it's a nearly impossible question to answer that way, but what would you say is the single most important step business leaders can take if they're interested in getting going in reporting-led transformation?
Yeah, look, the inevitable, get started somewhere. And whether you get started on finding the data in your company and evaluating them to inform your strategy and then reporting after that, or whether you go the other way around on having a debate around your strategy and how that really embeds sustainability thinking and sustainable action with a view to long-term value creation. Start somewhere and get going with it, because the reporting deadlines start sneaking up on us. It's not going away, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been really fantastic to have you on ESG Talk today. I hope the audience have taken a lot away from that.
Thank you so much, Andy and Workiva for having me on this ESG Talk.
It was such a pleasure speaking with Nadja. You heard her talk about standards, the impact of regulations like CSRD, and the roles of CEOs and CFOs in driving initiatives. Now let's listen back to a conversation between my colleague Mandy McReynolds and Allyson Anderson Book, Chief Sustainability Officer at Baker Hughes. Allyson offers some interesting perspectives about the importance of engaging the board and how her team is preparing for upcoming regulation and transforming Baker Hughes' annual sustainability report, warts and all.
Today, we're joined by Allyson Anderson Book from Baker Hughes. Allyson is the Chief Sustainability Officer, where she leads the company's energy transition efforts. Her leadership has helped Baker Hughes gain recognition on Newsweek's 2023 Most Trustworthy Companies in America list. Congratulations to you, Allyson, and your team for this incredible work and honor. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me here today. It's always great to come on and talk about where the world's headed in the world of sustainability. So, and for the acknowledgement on our hitting the trustworthy companies list, that was, I would say, one of the highlights for me in the time that I've had at Baker Hughes, is that we've gotten to that point that we're actually being really transparent. So I think it's fantastic.
Transparency and trust is quite the journey. And I love that you started there, even as we get recognized. Sometimes people forget what the journey takes to get to that point. So let's dig in there, because you had set a net zero target by 2050 and an interim target by 50% emissions reduction by 2030. So to support these ambitious goals and robust frameworks, you demonstrated your sustainability really best in class ESG reporting, and that was supported by Workiva. So that's how you and I know each other. And now let's kind of dig in there. Where did you really start to build this best in class work? And how has that evolved over the years for you?
I've been with Baker Hughes about 3.5 years now. And sometimes I think I just got here. And then other times it feels like it was like 18 years. It's complicated math to get to the 18 years. Where we started was first taking stock as to the efforts that we had to date and what have we committed to first. Okay. So that tells you your minimum standard. Like, we've got to at least say that we do that bit well in the data collection and showing our progress, right? And so for us, it was really because I was brought in to really help us build out the strategy on how we get to net zero as a company. It focused heavily on the emission side. And so Baker Hughes had been reporting its emissions for about 10 to 12 years by then to it was then called the Carbon Disclosure Project, but CDP today. And when I took a look at the emissions, I could tell that we were missing some data governance and fidelity, and potentially whole buckets of emissions weren't yet accounted for. And so since we had this net zero goal, I'm like, okay, let's back the truck up a little bit and let's dig a little bit deeper. And that actually led to a multiple year journey on saying, like, let's focus on inventory first, because even though we developed our net zero strategy in parallel, we had to think about what's the size, okay? And is this actually what we thought we were getting into when we made the goal? And so the long and short of it is, because we are pretty transparent here, is that first year we underreported by about 22%. And it wasn't due to any thing that we were trying to hide. It's just, we just didn't yet have everything that we needed to go out there and get all the information and pull it in. So that's where we started. It was deeply in that space of, is this right? If we're going to hang a roadmap off of it, it's got to be right. And so that launched everything. And then where we went over the years is I suppose, worth spending a little bit more time in.
What I value there about your candor and transparency is people often forget that getting quality data to be decision useful and strategy useful is a multi-year journey. So oftentimes people want to get right away to that aspiration or right away to that ambition. And it takes time. And I also, as you get into this work, I always tell people too, remember, there are some standards still being written for different industries. And so you may underreport because working from home doesn't have a global standard yet. Or what you might find is you overreport because that's the data you can estimate at that time for the calculation. And I love that you talked about the adaptability, the refinement, but also the transparency. These things happen. That's why there's footnotes in reporting. That's why there's an acknowledgement in report. And that's why the best practice is to do it annually. So as you've, in your experience, experienced some of the work and the transition over 3 years, what do you think is the advantage and how has that really strengthened the relationships with your stakeholders?
I would say it's that we can give investors a high degree of confidence that we don't have any surprises. And as regulators around the world are really waking up to this idea of requiring mandatory sustainability disclosures, not just emissions, we've got to be as tight to how we account, and that we have a high degree of data fidelity, accuracy, and clear governance structure to ensure that everything's in place, right? The advantage then is when you think about like pulling back a little bit, what poses a material risk to the company on the financial side? Well, if you made a net zero goal and you're a company like ours, which we're trying to really heavily get into that abatement part of the energy transition, it's really important to our company's value proposition that we're able to show that we can do that internally. Okay. And so we got to make sure that we walk our talk and that we are able to go out and then replicate that year over year for customers. All right. And so that advantage of what we're doing here is laying out a really firm foundation. And it took, Mandy, it took like twice as long as I thought initially to get it going. But that's because we were trying to figure out what the human capital part was as well. So it's not enough that you think, I've got to go do the things. Most sustainability teams today are really quite small still. And then maybe they're being reskilled. So you've got to work in those constraints. And so all these things just take a bit.
And I think that's an interesting collide in the market. And you have the tech and the talent and the teachers and consultants. And I tell people you pull those levers at different times to help get you to the right operational status. And I think that will continue to evolve as teams upscale. The other part that I think is unique or interesting as you talk about stakeholders is we just had our task force and we did a reflection because we actually paused and we took a meeting and we talked about looking at our strategy or material issues 18 months in. Where did we play the strategy of sort of checkers, like the movement there of short-term targets? And where did we look at chess, this broader notion of targets? What I thought was interesting was all the executives, the highest posted note or big conversation was, I love that we're walking our talk. And I think that's the part that we underscore is in transparency, in trust, how important that is to your internal team to see that and experience that. So I couldn't agree more with that statement. I'm curious, you mentioned as you're preparing, there's some regulation coming into play. What does that look like for you and how are you grappling through the regulational landscape today?
So we, for a while, were focused like so many US companies on thinking about what's the SEC going to do, right? Because you're thinking like that's it. Like as long as we get that and we're compliant in the country in which we're traded, we're good. No, Okay, we're not good because we operate in 89 plus countries. And so all those countries are also thinking like, the EU is doing this and the US is doing this, like we should think about this. And so now, as countries are thinking about mirroring each other, we find ourselves in a position where we may have to then comply with slightly different standards in many different countries. And so the one that's top of mind for us and for most bigger, Fortune 500 publicly or FTSE companies is that within the EU, it's pretty serious what they passed in the reporting directive. I mean, it's seriously, I'm a former regulator, okay? And I will tell you, like, I used to have some of my colleagues who were like, wow, these are really serious regulations. But what we were requiring, while it was hard, did not have the economic impact that this kind of a rulemaking out of the EU does have. Okay, so when we did a comparative analysis between where we're at today, Mandy, and where the directive, and this is without the member state guidance, like the country level, we counted about 1,100 metrics. Today, we have information governance that's analogous in the US to something like SOX level or like under the current GAAP standard, what you would do for financial reporting. And so we have that over, 250 metrics. And we're like fairly advanced, okay? And we know that we are fairly advanced in how we've had a very systematic approach to layering governance controls, sharing, and all of that stuff. And like, I can't imagine what other companies are thinking when they see that, if they're just getting started. So the single greatest challenge then is knowing that we're ahead, making sure that people understand even internally, that doesn't mean we're going to get to where we need to be in 2 years. And I think for listeners of this podcast, the important takeaway is it's not enough that you're reporting on a certain thing and having governance. You also have to have your third party independent verification. So you've got to transform what used to be it's a very financially driven data ecosystem into something that includes all of these disparate pieces of data that don't even have system of record keeping behind it. So now you're gonna have to build that too. Okay, so the more complex your company is, the harder that is to do. And so we've been building that out bit by bit because for the size of us and all the legal entities, it's not going to be clean. Okay, so I gave you kind of a long answer, but what a journey to go on. And we still got a long ways to go, but for everybody else just getting started, the key message for the entire podcast is don't wait.
Don't wait.
You gotta do it. Don't wait. This one's hard, guys. This one's really difficult.
Well, and I think that the CSRD, the regulation that you were talking about, I was just on a panel recently and I was shocked because it was a lot of ESG people who were transitioning, upskilling from primarily social roles or e-roles into a broader role and getting ready for this change, this evolution in the field. And you asked the question in the room, how many of you are multinational? 60 room full. It was supposed to be like a smaller session. We had to like bring a few more chairs in. And 90% of the hands went up and they have their US headquartered, but have global presence. And I think this is very telling that just because you're not headquartered, you still have to abide by the new global regulations and standards. And it is that work to get ahead. And the three things that I tell people is exactly what you said: partners. It might be your internal audit team, it might be your external advisory group, or looking at those who are supporting you in your finance that understand the rigor that needs to go into this. It may be partners in your ecosystem. If you're looking at impact, because you're going to have to show double materiality. Policy, like participate, provide feedback in the policies that are happening. And then pilots. I love where you went. People are trying to attack it all, and you've got to start small, scale from there. Our own Workiva journey is we're working on emissions first. We're working on governance and our strategy of that, the whole ESG goes, and then we're scaling to some of the other elements over the course of time. Pilots are perfectly good. So congratulations, you know, talking through all this work. You have finally released the report. You got the report out, which is a huge lift to do in Q1 and Q2 for organizations. Which new components of the report did you find most exciting?
Well, I think every year is just the journey. Okay, for one, is exciting. All right, because we layer stuff every year, like what you just were talking about on pilots. Every year we go in and I'm like, okay, this year we're going to turn this on, because you don't want to disrupt the annual production of things so much so that suddenly you're putting it out and it took you 8 months. Like then it's kind of pointless of that. So we turn on things every year, and so this year we continued to. I get excited about things, frankly, that are pretty nerdy, Mandy, and so because I'm in it all the time. But I would say that the nerdy bit is we expanded the amount of the planet data to third-party verification by our independent auditor. And so we're nearly at 100% completion finally. And now we've got 2/3 of our data under independent verification. And just for anybody listening, I'm always excited that all of our emissions data goes through the highest level of assurance by both internal audit and reasonable assurance by KPMG for scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so that's pretty exciting. The other part, okay, now if you read our report, you would never be able to pick this up, is that we went to a fully kind of automated solution that actually pushes up into the backside of Workiva, yes, as a part of our pilot together. And that was really exciting. And so we did something, and it was kind of by the skin of our teeth because we were turning this on over time, but we had just gone through, gotten all of that back end record keeping, everything done in time to do the end of the year close on emissions using our automation and then pushing it into Workiva. And that was audited, and we got it back and did it again a second time. And that's what you see in our numbers this year. And I got to tell you, we had a lower number of findings. We had a much stronger ability to close it out. I mean, I'm so excited. That was great. On performance, that's a whole other thing, okay? Because we continue to advance our energy transition journey in a really positive way. So continue to see deeper emissions reductions. We're almost 30% of the way there to the 50% mark. And so we're right on track to where we need to be for that. And then the other piece is as you look at our performance in social and governance, we had some warts, I'll just say. We had some parts that were less awesome. And what was so good this year is that we're finally able to articulate where we're focused strategically to really move the needle on how we think about people more sustainably. That is so important. And making sure that it isn't just about diversity, it's also about inclusion and other aspects. And so if you turn the page into the report, you'll see we articulate what we think entails sustainable for people, planet, and principles, and how we're going to get there in our progress, so that even if it was a little wordy, you'll see we have the clear way that we're going to advance progress towards becoming sustainable. That's new.
I love that. I think that that's resonating around the globe. Best in class looks like a movement away from perfection. And I think it's a movement towards the transparency and trust needed as the license to operate. People have asked a lot about, like, do you care about greenwashing or purpose washing? And I was like, I don't think people intentionally went out and tried to do that. I think people were very good practitioners. I have a lot of faith in colleagues like ourselves in the field. I think it's pushed this idea of, but I can not be glossy. I can admit what you just said, my warts. And I'm seeing best in class now look like more of a reality check that we see in earnings. You acknowledge what went well, you acknowledge the number you didn't make, and you freaking tell the street what you did and what you're doing to, get back on course. It's not that hard. We do it in finance. And I love that you and others are leading the way on how we acknowledge that in the same way. So as we wrap up this episode, it's been a powerhouse time together, Allyson. What's one takeaway related to reporting that you would offer up to myself and others like us that we should, our sustainability team should be thinking about?
I would remind people that there's a lot of times there's this, I won't say adversarial role, but people are a little bit leery about having a lot of board engagement. Okay. And it's sort of like exposing your operations and trusting that your board has your back and your best interest. And I will say, like, one of the single greatest areas of strength that we have as a company is that our board is gone through a bit of an educational process as we have, okay, and they've been there every step of the way. I mean, we've got a couple of very strong board members in this area who have, and frankly, one was the one who looked at me my first year and said, Allyson, you have to own the words too, okay? And like that moment of truth with her was so incredible for me. And so to have that trust in that earnest conversation with our board and have their support is great. So lean into the strength of having a really amazing and capable board for anybody who's in a publicly traded company. It is so important. Okay. Don't fear that. Embrace it. It's only going to make you stronger and help reduce your risk in the company. The more questions they ask, the better you are as a company. Probably not the answer that we were going to close on, right?
I love it. No, and I think you're exactly. And boards are changing. Boards are changing to assess members who have environment, social governance changes. Boards are changing to embrace it across the different committees where they have accountability. And I think you're right. It's nothing to fear. And by the way, if you're going to your first board meeting, people like us, we start somewhere. You start somewhere in a boardroom and you write down the lessons learned. It's like any other part of the job. And if you're great at stakeholder engagement, with most of us are, just a different group of stakeholders that you're now engaging with. So love that as our closeout and takeaway.
Thank you for joining us on ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode, be on the lookout for the premiere of season 3. My co-hosts, Mandy, Ernest, and Steve, and I will be back in January with a very special episode to kick off the new year. In the meantime, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see episodes from season 3 on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk again soon.